Welcome to Malcolm and We, heard exclusively on malcolmpresents.com, a streaming platform heard around the world and beyond. I'm expecting one day to be riding in my car or listening to my TV. We're going to get a signal from a voice. Hello, are you Malcolm from Malcolm? Someone from outer space. I mean, th this show goes into the atmosphere. It's just sent up. So if there are any spaceships around, they might hear this.
Sounds like that movie Galaxy Quest.
Yeah. All those things people did imagine can happen.
Yeah. Well,
So I'm waiting. Anyway, I'm Malcolm Berman, your co-host, your host, and that's Yana Larson, my co-host with the long braids. And do you usually wear your glasses, Yana, during the show?
No.
No, I'm
Uh,
just because I see her and she looks exquisite in the glasses. She get different colors. I think I would like green and yellow and
I
red
like purple.
or purple, whatever you want. And introduce our guests
Yes.
like they need like they need introduction.
Right. Well, I'll start off by saying welcome back. For our first time talking with them, we barely scratched the surface of Liz Gould and Paul Fitzgerald's incredible story, delving into their time as journalists during the tumultuous era of Afghanistan and the Carter administration. We quickly realized one episode wouldn't do it justice. So we had them back for part two to talk about the mystical relationship with what happened in Afghanistan and Paul's heritage as a Fitzgerald from Ireland, as in the same Fitzgeralds of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And again, we realized that two episodes still wouldn't do it justice. Now we are here for part three, and let's see how far we get. For those past episodes, please go to Malcolm and We on malcolmpresents.com and to our podcast on Buzzsprout. So, again, we are thrilled to have Liz and Paul here to talk with us. Here we go. Forget the simplistic good versus evil narrative we were fed about Afghanistan. Liz and Paul witness the stark contrast between the official story and the reality on the ground, a reality often manipulated by the media. Their new book, The Valediction, Resurrection, weaves a captivating tale, blending historical investigation with mysticism. We'll explore Paul's personal connection to Afghanistan, tracing it back to his Fitzgerald family's role in the Norman invasion of Ireland. But this isn't just a history lesson. We'll also be confronting the unsettling possibility of a deep state operating beneath the surface of well known events. Could the assassination of John F. Kennedy be tied to an 800-year-old vendetta? To truly understand these hidden forces, we must be willing to ask the hard questions and accept the unsettling answers. Get ready to have your perspective challenged.
Wow.
And with that, we have Liz and Paul. Take it away. You have the floor.
Welcome back, Liz and Paul. That's what we were talking before the show. Right now, they release all these information about the JFK assassination. But according, from what we talked about, this goes back centuries to how it began. Tell us.
Well, I what we like how we like to frame this is all of the stories that are focused on and all of the attempts to know who and why JFK was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963, are all from the 20th century. In fact, the history and the legacy of the Fitzgerald family is almost completely ignored. And when you actually factor it in, and this is our position, you realize that the biggest motivation of all is, in fact, the historical record. that goes back 800 years. And again, I would say I would have to describe whether was it George Bush who was in charge? Was it Allen Dulles who was in charge? Was it Lyndon Johnson who was in charge? What role did the mafia play? What role did the Cuban Americans play? Well, the truth is they all played a role. It was a very, very crafted, scripted event. And all of these systems did in fact have real operational purpose, but they were not running the show. Because when you look at the assassination in Dallas on that day, you realize it was a masterful ritual of such detail, orchestrated at the highest level, that could never have been accomplished by any single one of those groups alone. It was a far masterful event. So part of what we have been looking into to see where this important connection came from goes back to when what you mentioned, the Norman invasion of Ireland in 1169 was the beginning, when the Fitzgeralds, along with Strongbow, who was working for Henry II at the time, basically had the invasion of Ireland. And over 400 years, the Fitzgeralds had a growing battle with London, okay, over their rule of Ireland. And by 1583, the last Earl of Desmond, who was effectively the last leader of Afghanistan, of Ireland at the time, mixing up my countries here, okay, basically was beheaded in 1583. Well, it turns out there's an interesting date that he was beheaded on. It was November 22nd, 1583. 380 years later, on November 22nd, JFK is assassinated. What we want people to consider grasping is that those two dates are not accidental at all. And you have to say, well, how can these two dates, separated by 380 years, have something to do with each other? And that's what we are now going to talk about. Paul, would you like to?
Yeah, I mean, that was a revelation to me, actually. I hadn't realized we've been studying all this stuff. And it just occurred to me the other day that there were two calendars that we were dealing with, the Julian calendar and the Gregorian calendar. And at the end of 1582, it was decided that there would be a change of counting, the way in which the days were counted. Because apparently every year the Julian calendar was adding up leap year upon leap year upon leap year, because they weren't counting the days correctly. The number of hours in the days and the number of days in
So
the week.
there was an extra day in our extra day in the year.
Right. It turned out there was
Well,
something like 6 leap years. They got to 7 leap years, and they said, we have to do something about this. So they corrected it. And so London didn't go along with it. And British history, until 1752, when they accepted the Gregorian calendar. But the fact is that the last Earl of Desmond, which really what the English did was they anathematized the last Earl of Desmond, because he wasn't going along with the takeover of Henry VIII. And Henry VIII established himself as king. When he came, he was simply a prince of Ireland. He was not accepted as the ruler of Ireland. By the time Henry VIII left the scene, he was considered the king of Ireland as well. But under Elizabeth, it really wasn't an issue. And the leadership of Ireland pretty much went back and forth. And the three largest earldoms in Ireland ran the country for most of the 15th and 16th century. So, and those earldoms were the earldom of Leinster, or Kildare. It's referred to as both, and Desmond. And my family, the Fitzgeralds of Desmond, my family still has a farm in that area. And the last Earl of Desmond's had a castle in Abbeyfield. And actually, that's the town where my grandfather's farm was and still is. He wrote a letter to Queen Elizabeth kind of suing for peace, that it was crazy to carry on a war between England and Ireland, considering that they were both the members of the same family, the Tudor family, and that going back to the origin of the Fitzgeralds in 1169, 1170. And so that didn't happen. And so the war against the Geraldines, it's called the Desmond Wars, was basically waged by a group surrounding Elizabeth of Neoplatonists. Now, Neoplatonism was something that was created. It was Plato's original teachings, which were rediscovered during the end stage of the Roman Empire and rewritten by a guy named Plotinus. And he basically took the ideas behind Platonism and added a kind of mystical attachment to it, gave it a kind of supernatural aspect that Plato had not included, which included the cosmos. So the planetary involvement and the influence of the planets, it's basically what astrology became, okay? And so 800 years later, it was reintroduced again when they were discovered after the Crusades and the various scrolls were being unraveled in terms of what was going on in European involvement with the Middle East. So they added Kabbalah, and they added a number of different mystical things to it that hadn't been in it originally. And so you have all these influences that are going on there through someone by the name of John Dee. Dr. John Dee. He was the Queen's astrologer and mystic, and he used these things. He was the original 007, who was hanging out spying for Francis Walsingham, who was Elizabeth's Secretary of State. So
now, at this time, was Ireland was it still entirely Catholic, or did it become part of Protestantism?
There were a few earldoms. This is just it. The three major earldoms were Desmond, Kildare, and Ormond. Ormond was right next door between the two of these, basically Fitzgerald-controlled earldoms. And Ormond was they intermarried. In fact, the last Earl of Desmond's wife was the mother of the Earl of Ormond. So you had this kind of relationship that was going on, and the two of them used to fight constantly. And so that's what happened. He got into there was a complaint over the rents that were being paid by Ormond on lands that were owned by Desmond. And so Desmond put together his own army. He had his own army. He didn't pay any obedience to the crown whatsoever. He kept the money for himself, funded his own army of about 4,000 or 5,000 retainers, and went to war with Ormond. Once again, he'd gone back and forth over it. And apparently,
now, how did this speeding this up a little bit? How did the problems with the Fitzgeralds? What was their main problem? They had almost like a vendetta against the Fitzgeralds.
They did, yes.
Yeah, well,
that had been going on since Henry II in 1170.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I like to say the Fitzgeralds, once they touched the land of Ireland, apparently began to fall in love with the Irish people. And by the 16th century, they had become so totally invested in basically making it clear to London that their loyalties was with the Irish people. And that almost is treason, okay, to the crown, to London. So what you were seeing was over 400 years was an attempt to break them of that. But
Irish ways and Irish women.
But instead of breaking them, they actually got more and more dedicated to the Irish people. And so that's where we have to bring it to when the last Earl was beheaded. And it also happened to coincide with the creation of the British Empire, okay? That was actually considered to be a sacred sacrifice for that creation. And this is our point about the ritual nature of the assassination of JFK in Dallas, okay, is undeniable. It is that we actually did a presentation about that at a Dallas convention on the assassination, is that history to basically lay out that case that the ritual nature is overwhelming. But what we didn't present back then was this connection to the beheading of the last Earl as being part of that ritual too, because it was at the very beginning of the British Empire. So what you have is a tie-in, and that's our point about the connection between these two events. We had already seen the logic that there was a connection historically. In fact, there are many people today in this country who would claim that they had a right to kill JFK because he was a Catholic president in a Masonic country. We actually got a communication from someone who presented himself as a heretic, who basically claimed that this country could not be ruled by a Catholic president. This would have actually been in 2016 when he communicated with us.
And it's still relevant to today's day and age.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. There are people who still actually will justify this on that basis. And what was it based on? It was based on the burning at the stake of Jacques de Molay, the last leader of the Knights Templar in 1314. And that was the schism that caused a breach with, they were, remember, at that point, they were all Christians. There was no Protestant church yet.
Yeah, they were all Catholic.
They were all, well, Christian, yeah, I know, but Christians as opposed to being
The law,
Catholic versus,
the law was ecclesiastical
Right.
law. It was canon law.
but there was no split in Rome at that point. There was the Orthodox Church that had just split, but the Church of England had not come up.
That was the Eastern Orthodox.
Right. But
But under Catholic law, under canon law, if you were a ruler of an area and you appealed to the Pope, you could be granted sovereignty by the Pope. So you didn't have to go. This was a real problem for Henry VIII and the Elizabethans, because the Fitzgeralds were still remaining Catholic, and the
Right.
13th Earl had actually gone secretly to the Pope and said, we want to declare our own independence in Southern Ireland from Britain, from England. And so that's why this whole issue over, as I said, Henry VIII came in as he was considered to be the Prince of Ireland, not the King. Okay, and these earls were the ones who actually controlled everything. And by 1580, in the 1570s, the 1580s, they had complete control. They weren't paying any homage to London at all. And so there was a complete issue, and London was also afraid because of this schism between Rome and London, that they would find the Spanish and the Italians to come in and use Ireland as a platform to attack and invade England.
Right.
And so that's where you have this real intrigue going on. It was very similar to our Cold War.
Well, you see, you have to realize that from London's point of view, the Fitzgeralds were a challenge potentially to their ability to rule eventually, which became the British Empire. The actual creation of the British Empire was, they had what was called the Desmond Wars. They were for over 30 years, these ongoing wars.
Yeah.
And Ireland, too, actually became the first, this was the first conquest of the British Empire. So and they effectively ruled for the next 400 years with a very heavy hand. So that's why when this final end of the Desmond control, they were the ones who were really the last fighters against London, really took place. It was a huge shift because that allowed them to feel confident in their ability to create the British Empire. And when you add in the fact that the last Earl of Desmond, see, the Fitzgeralds were of a Tudor line. This was a royal line going back to King Arthur. And Elizabeth was of a Tudor line too. And one of the potential husbands for Elizabeth was the last Earl of Desmond. So he doesn't end up her husband, he ends up beheaded. But that's part of what we're pointing out about the level at which the Fitzgeralds were engaged in this was a real threat to London.
Now who, fast forwarding to 1960, who took up the mantle for this vendetta? Is there a group that all of a sudden knew the history and it was sort of like preordained?
Well, we have, I mean, there were a lot of different systems that ultimately, as I mentioned, in 2016, receiving this clearly stated letter from a clear Masonic believer in the Masonic foundation of this country, and that Rome was the threat, and this country was created for to deal with the threat, protect all of the ones threatened by Rome. And that is a very real phenomenon. Now, but when you get into the specifics, that's where a lot of the focus on the Alan Dulles and the world he comes from, and he with Wall Street and the lawyers and the finances, and and a lot of them, of course, when you look at their pedigree when it comes to masonry, were in many cases 33rd degree Masons, so very high level.
But then you have to look at competing families too. Yeah. And one of those competing families would be the Bush family.
Yes, that's the real competition.
Very much so, yes. And
I recognize that name.
Well, we have a little piece of history that makes it more credible what we're trying to say about the competition between the Fitzgeralds and the Bushes. The Bush family actually is related through Strongbow, through Richard de Clare, to the Fitzgeralds. These are what this would have been in the 12th century that we're talking about, and that lineage for the Bushes goes back to Strongbow too. So you're dealing with families that really have deep historical roots. So it does turn the true nature of George Bush's desire that his family be the one who was going to have multiple generations of Bushes in the White House. And what did we end up with? We ended up with, obviously, with his son, and they were actually trying to, get the next son in line.
For whatever reason, this reminds me of in a way, The Godfather. When the leader of the gang in Italy kills the father.
Right.
Then he wants to kill the mother and he wants all the kids to die because he knows that when the kids, they're going to have a vendetta against him, or their children are going to have a vendetta. So basically, that's the story you're telling.
Well, a lot of people, there are some people who believe that we have this thing called the black nobility, which is run from what was originally Venice, Venetian traders and Venetian bankers who basically established the rules of the game in Europe. In the 12th century, you have the wars of the Ghibellines and the Guelphs. You have that was something that the Fitzgeralds were apparently involved with before they came to England, before they participated in the invasion in 1066. So you have these long lines and these families that are involved in these disputes, and there are vendettas. As you said, there are vendettas, but the vendettas go back to the 9th century, the 10th century, the 12th century. You have different intermarriages between these families, so it gets very complicated along the way.
Yeah. Well, the problem is, especially with the European royalty, everybody is somebody's cousin because of the intermarriages between royalties.
Well, actually, their intermarriages were actually quite close in many cases. They were well known for, first cousins and such marrying. And there are those like Carol Quigley, who's commented about some of the mental problems that has produced in many.
Well, hemophilia was one of the. It was called a royal disease.
Right. And, okay. Again, getting back to 1963, was it 64?
Yeah, right. Well,
who took the mantle then? Who is there a group where people who say, I am, responsible, I am going to do this vendetta?
Well, I don't think that it's so much that they're claiming it. I think that it's the tracking all the evidence that shows a lot of activities on the part of George Bush, on the part of Alan Dulles, that leads a lot of people to believe, and Lyndon Johnson, as three people who have been identified as potentially the lead one, the one that had motivation to actually orchestrate the whole thing. But what is never really considered when they're making those choices is who is the only one of the three, for instance, that actually goes back to the origin of the Fitzgerald family, and in fact has an ancient root connected to the Fitzgerald family. The only one is George Bush that we
Yeah,
know.
I'm only coming to the conclusion that on an intellectual level, whoever did it really didn't know what they were doing. It was almost inherited. Their a hate or their assassination attempt was inherited that they may not have been conscious of. It was something they were born with.
Well, I think that I think they come with the belief they have a right. And one of the things you have to realize is that when the Fitzgeralds basically decided to stay in Ireland and fight for the Irish people, they severed from that royal lineage in a very powerful way. They chose the people over the royals. And that is a betrayal to the royals. And that's why there is such hatred. And JFK embodied that hatred because he arrived and began to show the signs very early on that he was trying to represent the people and a peaceful world.
Well,
That's what the evidence shows.
There was another movement in Europe that precipitated World War I, the Synerkist movement. And that was a group, high-level people. You had the Habsburg Empire. You had all these different ancient empires that were coming across and running the show. And they were kind of, they had to look into the future. That we were approaching the end of the 20th century and looking to see who was going to rule. And there was a strong movement to reject the Enlightenment and reinstate the feudal classes that had created Europe in the first place. And they had a long history of doing it. And you can look at the Bilderbergers and you can look at the creation of the EU. And a lot of that stuff, it really looks back. You look back 100 years at the Synerkist movement, and it's very similar in terms of denying individual rights, denying even nationalities. They wanted to combine it. I recall reading years ago that someone had considered the SS during World War II, the German SS, to be the inheritors of the SS were the European Union people. And there were a lot of people. If you think back, remember was it Kurt Waldheim you had, and a number of individuals who were very high-level people in the European Union when it first got started, the Bilderberg organizations and the various groups like that, who were high-level SS people, high-level Nazis. And even at the end of World War II, you had William Draper, who was put in charge with Paul Nitze, who was very much, in fact, Paul Nitze, who I believe was Jack Kennedy's
Secretary of Navy,
Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He actually was brought when he was put before the Senate. They asked him. They said he had an official role in World War II, and they asked him. They said, if we have to align with somebody, should it be Great Britain or should it be Nazi Germany? And he said, my favorite is Nazi Germany. Now, this guy went on, he was not, that was brought up apparently after World War II, that he had testified on that behalf. And he said it was purely on the basis of business. Business was going to let the Germans we'll run North America and South America and the Pacific, and we'll let the Germans run Europe.
Yeah, I've heard that line. It's not personal, it's business.
Yeah, it's just business. And that's really what it comes down to at the end of the day. So, there's a lot of other stuff in the mix here. And some family lines are involved with it from generation to generation. And like the Drapers, once they've made their money, they're still in business. I mean, we have Draper Labs here in Boston that built Israel's Iron Dome.
Well, the only thing I ask of you is, can I have the movie rights to your book?
Well, you can direct it for us. How's it?
Now, the directing, I'm not interested. The producing, yes.
Let's talk.
Let's talk, right?
Let's talk.
Yeah, because it's fascinating stories, but it seems like if you trace anything back, it's almost like predestined.
Well, there is a
preordained.
And this royalty thing, and the royal families of Europe taking back over the control of the direction of the course of where we're going. I mean, this has been going on since at least the First Crusade, and probably earlier than that.
Well, I do think that is part of what we are experiencing is the attitude of our leadership is basically saying we want to basically continue to lead the way we've been leading, and no matter what the people have to say about that is becoming less and less important. Uh, and and what is it that they want? Unfortunately, it appears as if they're a little too interested in continuing endless wars.
Yeah.
That's exactly what
I'm,
JFK was challenging.
we met somebody after 9/11 and they said, they said, I used to think I was just a pawn on the chessboard. And they said, I realize now I'm not on the chessboard
At
at all.
all.
Right.
Just the dust under the table.
You're right.
Well, now I'm not getting into politics, but we have a president that wants to reinvent the aristocracy,
Oh,
that
Well,
he wants to be
he wants
king.
to take us back to a feudal societies where just
Exactly.
you
We've
know,
been heading in that direction, though. I think what we're
yeah,
seeing from Trump is basically the revelation. I mean, we're living in
right,
the apocalypse
right.
occurring.
Maybe that should be your next project, tracing his lineage down, back to the old world.
Well, what we're really dealing with JFK, though, is a personal connection that Paul has through
Yeah.
his lineage. So
Yeah.
we're making it very personal for a reason. Okay. And that's what's really going to be in book three.
Right.
We're doing valediction revelation, which is where it all will be
But
told.
anyway, guys, you believe our half hour is up?
Wow.
Time flies when you're having fun.
Yeah. As I say, we may have to do a whole series of shows, do like a 13-week type of
Well,
series featuring you.
well, we're evolving. We are in the midst of evolving exactly this
I mean,
story.
this last revelation that I thought to myself after we did our last Zoom meeting, I thought to myself, there was a time shift at one point where they shifted the calendars, and according to the historical narrative, the last Earl of Desmond was beheaded
On the
on
11th
the 11th
of
of
November.
November. And I thought to myself,
Wow.
where the time shift happened. I wonder if there is a time shift. And I went back a few weeks ago and I looked at the calendars, and it was during that exact time that the time shifted from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar. And if you count it back from the modern era, there's an 11-day difference between the Julian and the Gregorian calendar, so it makes the 11th into the 22nd. So
Well,
it's oh my God, revelation.
Well, no, the 10th.
Revelations.
another point for the whole cosmic mysticism.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Yes.
But if,
I feel like we should introduce the show. Da, 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 da.
astrologically or astronomically, it would be the same day,
Yeah.
regardless. It was just how that was counted back in
Right.
1582 and
Right.
1580.
So in essence, how much control do we have over our lives or destiny?
I think we have a lot more than we think we do, actually, when you really comprehend what's really going on. That's why we're trying to bring this understanding to people about what JFK was for us. He was our martyr. He was not just a murdered
Yeah, he was
president.
our sacrifice.
He sacrificed for the completion of this immense process.
It sounded like another prophet I heard of, that sacrificed his life for the sake of people. Back about 2025 years ago.
Well, consider that what JFK represents is the human incarnation of that passion.
Anyway, again, are there any websites or
Oh, well, we have valediction.net where we have our stories and our books, and we do run a roundtable every month discussing what we are discussing right here. We've been doing it now since September of 21, actually. And it's an evolution that we're continuing to keep getting deeper and deeper into the getting to the source.
We're getting to the it.
The it, right.
yeah?
What
But
is
I'm just wondering, with our modern technology, whether we could do shows with you guys, almost as hosts, and interviewing people back in the old country.
Oh,
To do it from England and Ireland, and I don't know if there's any Scottish mixed up.
Well, the Scots, I'm sure they find their way into a lot of things.
Anyway, guys, again, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And tell people if they go over to malcolmpresents.com, they can see your 3 shows, and I'm sure there are going to be many more.
Okay,
Good.
great.
Again, you're listening to malcolmpresents.com with myself, Malcolm Berman, and my co-host, Yana Larson. See you guys next week.
Okay,
Bye.
bye-bye.